everyone. How are you doing? Good morning. Are we awake? Okay, good. I'll be awake in a minute or two. All right. This is my first slide. Okay, there we see it. Okay. Whew. Welcome. I am Guy Swann, the guy who has read more about Bitcoin than anybody else you know. And I have the honor today of kicking this thing off. And you probably know the podcast Bitcoin Audible, but you may not know about another project I started, I guess about 6 weeks ago now, called AI Unchained. And I wanted to talk about the marriage between Bitcoin and AI. That's why our talk is Bitcoin and AI, a match made in cyberspace. A little corny subtitle, but I'm sticking with it. I think these are the two most important technological developments happening in the world right now. And there are a ton of parallels between these two technologies that are really important specifically for Bitcoiners to understand. Because the head start that we have on kind of understanding the monetary shifts of the world, I think we can actually apply and add a multiplier if we properly understand the direction and the value of AI. And I was actually chatting with Mark Moss last night, and it was funny because he used the exact same analogy that Svetsky and I did on an episode of AI Unchained. But you know, everybody remembers 2017 crypto, the height of the crypto retardation, and that basically it was, you know, Bitcoin was huge. Bitcoin was suddenly a big deal. People were making a lot of money on it. Blockchain. And everybody wanted to stick a blockchain on everything. If you had some sort of an idea, didn't matter what it was, stick a blockchain on it, and it's like innovation. It was just everything blockchain. I actually remember a company that was trading on the stock exchange, and they didn't do anything to the company. They didn't change the business plan, like nothing changed, but they added blockchain to the name, and in like a couple of weeks, the stock literally tripled. Bananas on the blockchain were literally a thing. So I use that example because AI is basically filled with that right now. It's got the crypto disease. And separating the signal from the noise is incredibly difficult because everybody's just sticking AI into their thing. AI with email, AI notes, and God knows what else. As soon as I had my first touch point with AI, that really kind of blew my mind was ChatGPT and then also Stable Diffusion, the image diffusers. And my first thought was, holy crap, this is incredible. Holy shit, is this going to be like a really, really terrible centralizing force against what Bitcoin is doing? Because I kept hearing that you have to have thousands and thousands of GPUs to do this, and you know, Google has their new model and it's like 100 trillion parameters and it's going to be better and everything. It's got more neurons than the human brain. Like, so there's all this hype about, like, you know, are we creating God and all of this stuff? And I immediately was like, I think it's critically important that we understand this to make sure that we don't go there. Because if we do, all I could imagine was that AI was going to essentially be the worst surveillance nightmare that you could possibly come up with. If only a $1 billion corporation can run these things, and this is actually that valuable, then we're all going to be plugging into it, and it's going to have a contextual understanding of everything we do on our computers, everything we're doing at all times. It's going to be able to predict where we're going to click before we click on it, and we're not going to be able to get the productivity gains without plugging into those giant servers. So honestly, that kind of scared the shit out of me. So I felt like I really needed to understand what it was. And in doing so, there's this question, you know, have we created God? We created a super intelligence. And I want to say no. No. In fact, like with OpenAI and ChatGPT, there's they have an OpenAI playground, which will actually just show you what it's doing, essentially. It's just a prediction machine for text. And it takes the context of, the specific word, a group of words, and then the entire sentence, and it literally just has a probability for how likely the next word is. Like, that little thing on your phone where it's like predicts what you're about to type? It says like, I went to the, and it says store, bar, BitBlockBoom, like in the fill in the blank. And you could select one. Well, it's basically that on steroids. And so you're just guessing, and the playground will actually show you the percentage of the likelihood, like 73% likelihood that this is the next word if you go play with it. But I'm out of free tokens, so I'm not paying for that shit. So we did not create God. It is a technology, and it is a form of intelligence. But it's not some super intelligent being that's going to eat us all. With that, there is good news and there's bad news. Unfortunately, there is actually a lot of bad news that we don't have time to cover, but these are the main elements that I think are relevant to Bitcoin, and I want to hit a couple of them. First is that AI is an insanely deflationary force. It is going to really change how we do things, and it is going to replace an enormous amount of menial, tedious tasks and kind of administrative. I think the administrative economy is really going to get hit hard. Everybody's talking about like how many jobs are you going to take? If you read any article, it's literally anywhere between like 5 million jobs are going to be taken before 2030 to literally 300 million. I think it was a Forbes article that says 300 million jobs are going to be taken. I think it's an exaggeration. You could have said the same thing about the internet, but anyway. The one interesting thing about this is that what it does is it actually takes a lot of the economic capital that we thought was not information technology and was not in the scope of the digital revolution, and it kind of aggressively shoves it into that paradigm. So I think we're going to get a sort of Moore's law in areas of the economy that we did not expect was going to be the case for potentially a really long time. In fact, the reason I put the price of tomorrow up there, if you have not listened or read the price of tomorrow, if you haven't read it at all, you have a problem, you should fix that. But if you haven't read it in a while, you should read it again, because I think in the context of the technological shift we're seeing, it's just so much more potent with kind of the framing of AI, now that it's kind of here and we can see it and play with it. Now, the other problem is that if you just so happen to have $31 trillion in debt, really a massively deflationary force is a huge problem. So we're going to have to get a lot of inflation. Like, one of the things that inflation has to do is essentially outpace, it has to erase all of the natural price deflation that the growth would enable in the money supply. And because of that, there's going to be a massive amount of money printing just to stay at baseline. And in doing so, it means that more and more capital is going to be allocated towards the political and counterfeit class. Because the more that they take our productivity gains, the more all of our economic center basically sucks around them and their projects and everything that they want to do. So that's not exactly the best news. Disruption as the norm. So if we go back kind of like a half a millennia, business models were a lot simpler, and production structures were a lot closer to from production to product, especially just in relative terms to what we have today. And but fast forward to the digital revolution, like you can even actually use like your grandparents or whatever as an example, is that, they grew up in a world where you could just learn to do one thing really well, and then you had a career and you did that shit for 50 years and then you retired. That world does not exist anymore. It's done. And we're entering a phase where AI is actually it's interesting. It operates a lot like, I use the example of a 3D printer, because one of the things that a 3D printer does is it allows you to iterate. It gives you a production tool that isn't locked to any certain object. You usually would have to have like a giant machine, and it has to have like some very specific tooling or operation in order to print like one gear, and then you print like 1,000,000 of those gears. Whereas additive manufacturing will, like, the operator can now just kind of sit around and come up with a bunch of ideas and iterate on the same product like 100 times in a day. And if you've got a production line of additive manufacturing, well, you could completely change what your product is or what you're offering to the market basically overnight. You just shut them all down, download a new design into the machine, and then start printing again. AI is kind of like that for task management and software and media generation. So it's like Stable Diffusion and these things are basically like a form of media that generate media. And it's software that generates software. And the operator is just trying to guide it as to what to create. You're prompting it to give you back some sort of structure or some sort of idea. And in that sense, also, there's an interesting way to think about what AI is that I like to, it's a little crude, but I think it works, is that it's kind of like a really, really aggressive compression algorithm that doesn't actually store, again, image diffuser is a great example, is that it doesn't actually store any of the images. If you search an image on Google of like a cat, you'll just get images of a cat. If you search the same thing again, you'll find the same images of a cat. It's just recalling something that's saved. Whereas when you train a model on like 1,000 images of a cat, what it does is it stores the relationship between the pixels on the screen that give you the relative shape of a cat. So if you give it cat, what it will do is it will literally generate an image of a cat that never existed, but it will do it from all of the patterns that it stored, that it learned from all of the images of the cats that you gave it. So it's like a hyper compression that none of the images actually exist there, but the patterns that the images represent are stored and can be regenerated. So what I think all this means in the context of disruption is that because we kind of have the 3D printer of software, so to speak, is that the norm will be a constant disruption of the economy. And I think it will actually start happening, so it will get faster and faster. It will continue to accelerate to the point that when we start into another phase of disruption and changing how we tool and how we operate, it actually will not have enough time to seat itself properly in the economy before the next disruption stage will already be started. And that's going to be a volatility is probably the first word that comes to mind. Second is, or another element is we have knowledge is power. And companies are realizing just how much, they're realizing that users are a massive resource that they didn't know. Users are essentially producing a new resource that they weren't before. So we were already being harvested for our metadata. We were already being harvested for our social graphs and all of this information. Now, we're a great way to train their own personal model, their own company's model. Zoom just actually changed their terms of service or whatever, that now they can use your likeness and your voice and your conversations to train their AI model. This is going to happen a lot. And because of that, they're closing down. They're going to start to silo a lot because they're realizing that if they have anybody that has a community, that has a user base that they can watch, they think that they're going to have an advantage over the other companies by locking in their user base so that they can watch you and they can use your feedback to train their AI and obviously produce the better product. Yeah, so I think what this means is a aggressive increase in the amount of walls coming up on the internet and companies and platforms being siloed. Think of kind of like the the problems of Apple and iPhone, except kind of spreading to a lot of different areas in the digital economy. Now this one, prove that you are human. We have a lot of different ways of quote unquote proving that you are human online. Don't mean shit anymore. They're all useless. Like, in fact, actually, you want to just play like 10 seconds of this video? We'll get to it in just a second. But all of the methods that we have to prove, in fact, the number one method that we have to prove that we are human online is KYC. Take a selfie with your ID, solve a CAPTCHA, these sorts of things. Well, if AI can regenerate your likeness instantly, it can regenerate your voice instantly. Now, actually, the newest models, you need 3 seconds, 5 seconds. If you ever get a phone call from somebody you don't know, and you just say, hello, hello, anybody there? That's all they need to train a model, to turn a model on your voice, and then they can turn around and call somebody that you know and be like, hey Bob, what's up? And it will sound exactly like you. Like, that's you know that scene in Terminator when the liquid metal Terminator kills his parents and then calls them up on the phone? Sounds like him. Like, that's the world we live in. That's not science fiction anymore. I can do that on this computer. And because of that, fraud is going to go through the roof. And when you have a sorry, 1 second. When you have a product that you're offering to somebody, a computational service that has immediate cost. In fact, Sam Altman said that every single time they run ChatGPT, that it costs upwards of 8 cents for every single time you ask a question to it. 8 cents instantly. And I want to talk about what that means.
I am not Morgan Freeman, and what you see is not real. Well, at least in contemporary terms, it is not. What if I
just saw that video. It was crazy. The fact that you can just kind of do that live now is so nuts. So what's the good news? There's actually quite a bit of a Bitcoin lining to this. So first, and what's funny is that line up the top, we have no moat and neither does OpenAI. There was a leaked memo from a Google engineer that was sent around internally. And I almost did the entire talk on just that memo because it's one of the craziest things. It's what got me starting AI Unchained. It's why I started the show. And essentially, I think open source has a really natural advantage here. First, you do not need thousands of GPUs to run these things. Like I said, I can run some really fascinating stuff just on this machine. And this is not optimized for AI. The hardware isn't even there yet as far as like being geared toward it. All the companies, all the hardware companies are now making that happen. So the next iterations of products and chips are all going to be AI optimized. But one of the really crazy things that open source has is that companies building a model from scratch is insanely expensive. But if you're working on an open source model, you've already got a community that did all the work for you. And there's this natural advantage. There's something called low rank adjustments. And we're seeing this same sort of thing in LLMs, but it's not called exactly the same thing. But this is in image diffusers. And it's basically micro trainings on one specific thing. And you can have a whole community they're all training. Like, let's say you want an image diffuser that's like a little bit better at generating images of people in a suit. And so you make a low rank adjustment and you train it on just like 100 high quality images of someone wearing a suit. And then you can actually retrain without doing with the main model, the base model staying the same. You can actually retrain it to teach it to better make someone in a suit. And when you have a community doing thousands and thousands of these little micro adjustments, you actually get extremely high quality content because everybody's very like centered in on getting the quality of what they're trying to do. And you have this pool of essentially knowledge that's feeding back on itself, and nobody's having to redo the work over and over again. Another thing is that the establishment and the regulatory apparatus are crippling the shit out of their AI tools. They're making them unoffensive and safe, which open source doesn't care about, which is great, because it means that there's all these sorts of use cases and restrictions in the establishment version of AI, the closed source AI, that they simply cannot serve, they can't meet. And then also with like the licensing problems is that OpenAI will actually, like, they're going to restrict what you can actually do with their API and how you can use ChatGPT. But with these free alternatives, the free alternatives are actually not only matching, but they're actually surpassing a lot of the closed source, like the OpenAI models of ChatGPT. And like Falcon came out not too long ago, and it immediately, a free model that immediately went to the top of the leaderboards of like user feedback and basically the quality of answers. And it just keeps getting surpassed. Like the leaderboards are just like active as shit. Like every just few days, there's another one that's up at the top. Llama 2, I think, is now up at the top. Again, another open source model. So basically the freedom to, there's a quote, and this is again from that memo. It says that people will not pay for a restricted model when free, unrestricted alternatives are comparable in quality. And this is actually what we're seeing. OpenAI, there's another a leaked document or whatever, that they might actually go out of business. They actually have they hold the record for the platform that has the highest growth, the fastest growth in users, like fastest to 1 million ever. And in June, they had 1.7 billion visitors to the ChatGPT service. And in July, they had 1.5. They're actually losing because people are just realizing that they don't have to pay a subscription, and they can just go off and run a free model, and they can have it for their company or their service. And I think what this is actually showing is that because they're these kind of like middling models that have outsized quality and outsized results, is that we're seeing a technology that actually greatly benefits the individual, the small, and the medium company or the medium service provider disproportionately than essentially the giant corporation. And the overhead for the giant corporation trying to train its own model is something that the smaller guys don't have to worry about. So I just thought this was crazy. The free version of ChatGPT, the smaller model, GPT-3, costs them $700,000 a day just to keep running. So that doesn't include GTP4, and that doesn't include their image diffuser. And we used to live in a world where API calls were largely costless. So going back to the thing I said about it costs 8 cents every time somebody asks it a question, is that what you're essentially doing is you're being given an API access to burn through somebody's GPU, just set it on fire. And what that essentially means is that if you're in a world of increasing fraud, what you're actually doing is you're providing an instantly delivered, irreversible product, which wasn't really the case. If somebody's just reading an article, there's no like real cost there. If somebody's like just watching a movie on your Netflix or whatever, and then you have to like cancel their subscription in 3 days, that's not that big of a deal. But if somebody can run up thousands and thousands of dollars in cost in just a matter of hours on your platform, and then you have to charge back, then you have to cancel, you can't get that cost back. You can't redeem that. That's not free. It is a bearer asset delivery. And because of that, that means that if corporations are crippling their own AI and with licenses and trying to be unoffensive, excuse me, then I think that means the open source economy has a chance of producing higher quality alternatives with a much larger array of services than what the corporations can. And if we see that the speed of economic change is going to get faster and disruption is going to be the norm, excuse me, I think that means that this is actually a huge negative pressure on massive corporations. It actually contributes to the diseconomies of scale. And again, it benefits the individual, the small, and the medium business far more because they're agile. They can change, they can retool quickly. Somebody who's already invested $2 billion in their product, in their design or their production flow is going to have a hell of a lot harder time adjusting to constant disruption than somebody who's small, agile, like the 3D printing versus the big machine sort of platform. And if none of the KYC measures can actually prove that someone is human, I think that we're going to see KYC everywhere. Everybody is going to start adding KYC because you just can't have an unlimited number of AI bots imitating everybody as much as possible on everybody's platform, just burning through capital and burning through the internet. But that means that on a long enough time span, KYC is dead. There's nothing they can do about it. It's going to get worse before it gets better. But if you have a platform that actually runs on public and private keys and just avoids the KYC shit altogether, you have a huge starting advantage because that's where things are headed. And it's going to be like the copyright fight against BitTorrent and file sharing, is that what they did is they tried to say, oh, the copyright's going to get worse and we're going to have DRM on everything and we're not going to let the user control the content. And what happened is they failed. File sharing basically forced them to change their entire business model. You can't restrict the music access. You're going to get it everywhere that you want. And the longer they fought it, the more money they lost. And that if you have a ton of fiat debt in a crazy price deflationary environment, well then the one thing you absolutely need is to be holding on to sound money. You need something that actually benefits from that price deflation rather than something that just turns the printing machine back on and that the government has to essentially print to infinity to make sure that their obligations don't get worse and worse and worse every year, naturally. And then if costs are instant and irreversible, and the payment method is delayed and reversible, well, then if you're building a system, if you're building an open source ecosystem with instantly delivered bearer asset settlement, where you send 8 cents the exact same moment that you execute a cost of 8 cents, well, then your margins are going to be a whole hell of a lot better than the corporation that's dealing with billions and billions of dollars of fraud that gets worse every single year. And not only that, you're going to be able to undercut them in price for any of the services that you provide. And essentially, you're going to be able to undercut them in the price of the services that you provide. Oh, sorry, and you'll have a better user experience. But that's kind of the beautiful thing about like NOSTR, is that you'll be in an environment where you can have an ecosystem where you can just kind of zap and get exactly what you wanted. And I think we'll find ourselves in a place where people will just kind of be shocked and wonder, how the hell did it never, shouldn't it have always worked exactly like this? But lastly, I think the path to heaven is straight through the gates of hell. And the problem here is that I think all of it gets a lot worse before it gets better. And, you know, unfortunately, that's a truth that we have to deal with. But I think that's a road that we can drive. I think that's a path that we as Bitcoiners are ready to take, because we already kind of knew that, and that's a lot of the reason why we are here. But the thing that I love about Bitcoin is that essentially everybody here is a builder. Like, it's full of builders. And not only that, it's full of people who actually have hope and actually realize that there's a chance of fixing this. Like, there's no nihilism here. We recognize that there's work to do, but that there's actually something better at the end of the road. And I think if we properly, again, this is why I started AI Unchained, and I think if we properly understand these new tools and work together to utilize an open source, collaborative, and self-hosted AI ecosystem, is that we will actually have a vastly, vastly better chance of getting the future that we are fighting for. So don't sleep on it. Thank you. Sorry, I was a little bit over and had to skip a section that I'm sad I actually had to get to. I don't think we have any time for questions, but I'll just say with the where to go page, please subscribe to AI Unchained. Like, this is really the point of the project, is to kind of unravel how important I think that is and how I think it's tied to Bitcoin. Obviously, Bitcoin Audible. I'm still the Guy Swann on Twix, Dexter, whatever the hell that thing is called. And as long as it's relevant, find me up there. And then obviously on NOSTR. And that page down at the bottom is not live yet, but bitcoinaudible.com/AI is actually going to have a bunch of tools that I have been using recently. I'm just going to like list it out. So if you want to kind of go down the rabbit hole, that's actually going to be like a good list of signal for things that I think would be really cool to check out. So thank you, guys. That's me.
Grandpa, why do you have so much Bitcoin?
Well, it all started in the year 2023 when I attended a conference called BitBlockBoom.
What's BitBlockBoom, Grandpa?
It was a conference where people talked about Bitcoin. This was way back when we used something called the US dollar for money.
What? Bitcoin wasn't always the world's money?
If it weren't for great speakers at BitBlockBoom like Jimmy Song, Adam Curry, and Preston Pish, we'd all be living in pods and eating bugs. Instead, I was able to avoid fiat enslavement and secure generational wealth.
F***ing legend.
Be the legend your grandchildren deserve. Experience the best Bitcoin conference out there and join the Bitcoin revolution. BitBlockBoom, the only conference for true Bitcoin maximalists. Book your tickets today at bitblockboom.com and use the code BBB1 for a special discount.